For more on this story, I am joined by Carlos Algara, an assistant professor of political science at Claremont Graduate University. Thanks so much for joining us here on France 24. We just heard there from our correspondent, this is an uphill battle for Nikki Haley. What chances do you think she has of breaking through here? Or do you think that the polls are right, that we are hurling towards a rematch between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, which, by the way, is a matchup that a majority of Americans don't want to see?
Absolutely. That's a terrific question. The polls in Iowa were fairly accurate, right? And they predicted an overwhelming victory for former President Donald Trump. I suspect that New Hampshire polls are also going to be on the mark. I suspect that President Trump will have this nomination pretty much wrapped up. We're looking at perhaps a double-digit victory for President Trump. He might be able to hit that critical majority mark that he needs to get. And after that, I anticipate, given the calendar of Nevada and South Carolina, two states that are less favorable to the former governor, Nikki Haley, I suspect that President Trump will have this nomination wrapped up either tonight or fairly shortly.
Okay, so over the weekend, Trump was on the campaign trail. He was praising Viktor Orban, the strongman leader of Hungary. Trump himself has said that he would be a dictator on day one. What would a second Trump term mean for the U.S. and for the state of American democracy, in your view?
Yeah, that's a critical question. That's a question that's very tough to answer. It depends what sort of happens in the congressional races. President Trump obviously he's espoused rhetoric that has been anti-democratic at times. What a second Trump term will look like is fairly hard to tell. And a lot of the ambiguity comes from the felony indictments that he's facing. What happens if, for example, he's found guilty in some of those 91 counts? We're sort of going into uncharted waters. Congress, obviously, if it's controlled by Democrats and somehow President Trump gets elected, that looks different than, say, a Congress controlled by Republicans. So there's a lot of moving parts here. Obviously, what President Trump is saying is very problematic and anti-democratic, and there's just a lot of ambiguity as to what a second Trump term would ultimately look like.
You mentioned these criminal indictments. How might a conviction change the equation in the presidential race if Donald Trump is convicted of a crime?
That's a great question. There's a couple of data points that give us a little bit of clues as to what can happen. This election is a little bit unique, where you have a former president seeking a rematch against the incumbent that defeated him in the prior election. So President Trump is running as a quasi-incumbent. And obviously, he's having a little bit of trouble garnering this nomination. Close to half the electorate in Iowa voted against him. It remains to be seen if close to half the electorate in New Hampshire will vote against him. That's a lot of opposition within the party. So even though President Trump is in the driver's seat for the nomination, there's clear data that shows that there's a fracturing here. And the biggest question is, what are those voters going to do? And what are those voters going to do if President Trump gets convicted of some of these felony counts? That's the biggest unknown question. Do they defect? Do they go to President Biden and support his reelection? Do they stay at home? What sides of the Republican coalition will be bothered by a conviction? Time will tell when and if that happens. So there's a lot of moving parts. I suspect that the Republican Party, in the event of a conviction, will have a sizable amount of fracturing, which is what you're seeing in these primaries. As I mentioned, if President Trump doesn't win a majority in New Hampshire today, that's clear evidence that the party is fractured because he is running as a quasi-incumbent.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about Donald Trump, but why has the Democratic Party stayed so firmly behind Joe Biden, given these low approval ratings and these widespread concerns you see about his age, which are reflected really in every poll?
That's a terrific question. It's very rare for an incumbent president to be challenged for the nomination. We haven't seen a serious challenge to a sitting president since 1980, when Senator Ted Kennedy from Massachusetts challenged President Carter. So these challenges are very rare. I think there's no shortage of ambitious politicians within the Democratic Party. I just think that they had a realization that President Biden just enjoys a broad support within the party, independent of his approval ratings amongst the general electorate. So President Biden is still very popular amongst Democrats. Over 80% of Democratic partisans support his reelection, approve of the job that he's doing. And, that's an insurmountable path. He has drawn opposition. In New Hampshire, the only candidate of consequence on the ballot in New Hampshire is Congressman Dean Phillips from Minnesota. So he has drawn a challenger that currently holds office within the Democratic Party. However, that's not a serious challenge. And so I suspect that a lot of ambitious politicians that would normally run for a Democratic presidential nomination, if it were an open seat, somebody like Governor Newsom, for example, here in California, I suspect that they just saw no path to victory, completely independent of President Joe Biden's approval rating right now amongst the electorate, which stands at about 39%. So they just made a calculation that they couldn't win a nomination, and politicians don't run races that they don't perceive a path of victory to.
Understood. Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Carlos Algara, an assistant professor of political science at Claremont Graduate University in San Diego. Thanks so much for joining us here on France 24.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.